Um, Tonight we are talking about campaign finance, and I'm curious how many of you know what campaign finance is?
Finances.
What do you
What do you
know
know
about
about
it?
it?
There's a lot of rules about having to disclose who gives what and where they live and what they do for a living. And, people of like-mindedness will get together and form political action groups and donate money to the candidates that they want. But still all those regulations of reporting are still kind of in place for them as well.
Yeah, so when we talk about campaign finance, we talk a lot about elections, candidates, um, money spent on politics during the election season. I guess technically it's not all politics. We'll see that. There's some politics it doesn't cover. Um, but yes, campaign finance. It was my first job out of law school, working at a firm that they challenged campaign finance regulations under the freedom of speech. And so that was something that was that firm's bread and butter. And so that was my first taste out of law school. I was in lawsuits from Rhode Island to Hawaii, and it was very interesting to see how aggressive some of the states became with regulating political speech, including outright banning certain types of speech during political elections and things. And so, and before we go all the way into that, I guess just a quick thing about Believe. We are this is under the umbrella of Believe, which is an organization where we are promoting private solutions to problems in society. We feel very strongly that there's a lot of good that can be built, and we work very hard to get people to collaborate, to be involved in issues, and work and address social issues every day so that we can have a better tomorrow. Our tagline is kind of that the future belongs to the believers. And we firmly believe that those who have faith that it's possible and work to build it can help to create that and make tomorrow better. So, as we talk, we love to hear all sides of an argument. We believe very strongly that people believe things are on one side or another because there's something they're keying into, and we want to understand what those things are. So we want to have a very open and frank discussion, but we do not tolerate name calling, putting people down. We'd like to find the merit in people's views and what they're talking about. It's not to say that we always agree or that we believe everything they believe, but we do ask for civil dialogue. We believe it very much encourages conversations. And so far, it's been really good, and I really appreciated the dialogue that I've had. My background, again, I mentioned a little bit. I am an attorney, been an attorney since 2010. And as I've looked at the Constitution, the laws, I've come to learn that law and morality are very closely related. And so, to me, it's impossible to talk about law without talking about morality. So we do have discussions about morality as well. We talk about those things. But every time we meet, I try and share some reason why it's important to be informed. This one's from Benjamin Carson. He says, I am convinced that knowledge is power to overcome the past, to change our own situations, to fight new obstacles, to make better decisions. And I would add, to shape a better tomorrow as well. When we know what we're talking about, we know the issues, we have a lot better chance of shaping the future in a good way. So I will always try and disclose if I have a bias or a premise I'm operating from. This is how I view liberty. I'm a big fan of liberty and promoting liberty. To me, liberty is a state between anarchy and tyranny. Anarchy is the state of no law. Tyranny is the state of all law, where law dictates our decisions. If you have anarchy and you have no laws, you have to have law to pull you out of anarchy and create some sense of order, some semblance of working together. But if you have too much law, you go towards tyranny. And so that space between liberty and tyranny, what's up here? This is where morality plays in. We have to have morality to balance out the law to keep us from tyranny. Um, or else as a society we break down. So the state of liberty is a balance between these 2 points, is how I view it. And we like to talk about that balance and where we're at. Sometimes maybe a law is necessary. Right now in America, I think we have so many laws, we're probably heavy on the side, and we could use a few less perhaps, but we would need some morality associated with it. And so, curious if anyone has any questions about this. Questions, comments, or thoughts, or their views. And again, this is the basis that I operate from in talking about what liberty is. So the First Amendment, we're talking about today again about freedom of speech. And we talked a lot more last time about freedom of speech. And so the First Amendment specifically says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. If we cut out the religion part, since we're focused on speech. Now, there will be a little bit today about the press, because Utah has a campaign finance law that's specifically targeted at the press. And so it'll be fun to look at. So Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And just keep that in mind. In the word abridging, when we speak about freedom, one of the things to know about the time when the founders formed the Constitution, there were still restrictions on speech at that time. You couldn't, for example, defame somebody, or else you could be sued and held liable for it. And so no court has ever viewed the First Amendment as saying that there's no regulation whatsoever allowed on speech. They've never taken that position. And that gets then into this interesting balancing that the courts try to do. And we'll see them doing that today with the cases that we're going to go through. So the first case is called Buckley versus Vallejo. Has anyone ever heard of this case? It's a big case from.
Well, I read what you sent.
Okay. So you got to read the overview of it. It's awesome. And if you get, we try leading into this one I about cases before and talked about it.
But I lived during that time, so.
Okay. So you know this time well. So Vietnam War. And Vietnam War, there's a lot of frustration in America over it, at least perceived frustration. A lot of voices, a lot of people protesting on college campuses, different things. Not popular. Nixon's coming up for re-election, and him and his advisors are worried that he's not going to win because Americans involved in the Vietnam War. So they decide their best course of action is to spy on the opposition or the other side, and they go and break into the Democrat headquarters at Watergate, and they steal some information. They wiretap the phones. They want to listen in and see what they're doing so that they can have counter strategies and things so that he can win again. Their initial break-in went very successfully. Nobody caught on, had no idea what was going on, but some of the wiretaps failed, and so they weren't getting all the phone calls they wanted. And so they decided to break in again, and 5 guys go back, break in, and at the very end of the break-in, a security guard just happens to notice something a little funny and ends up investigating further and finds these guys. So they get arrested. At the start, America has no idea Nixon's involved, no idea what's going on. Just 5 guys breaking the Democrat headquarters. And so a little bit later, Nixon gives a speech. It's about 2 months after, and he says, no one from the White House was involved in that. No, we have no knowledge of what was going on. Just crazy outside people. And so November comes around. I think that was in August or September, he says that. November comes around, he wins re-election in a landslide bid. So the war wasn't a concern, or their wiretapping was very successful and gave them the info they needed. I don't know. That he's re-elected. But things are adding up, and reporters and others looking at it dug deeper and deeper and deeper. And by 1974, they figure out that Nixon had arranged for hundreds of thousands of dollars to be paid to the burglars as hush money. and that Nixon and his advisors were behind these break-ins. And so this is the time you say you lived through. I look at it, we have allegations of a president right now, past president, they're alleged had criminal conduct. And it's interesting to look at, but he was a sitting president, and the heat really starts to come on, especially when they find out that he had instructed the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation into Watergate. So things aren't looking good. Nixon, again, doing the political things, resigns because of what's going on. Gerald Ford, which when I went to find a picture for Gerald Ford, I'll admit, I was like, have you ever seen this guy before? I don't recognize him. He's not one that comes up often in American history. But Gerald Ford, as vice president, becomes president, and he immediately pardons Nixon. And so, kind of nice if your vice president succeeds you. So just says, we'll pardon him, no problem. So Nixon doesn't go to jail, but they don't pardon anybody else associated with this. So these other guys go to jail for being involved in what took place. But America's now, during this time, understanding that, wow, this wasn't good. People are conspiring each other, doing illegal things to gain power. And it just looked and smelled really bad. And so Gerald Ford comes in and he needs to clean up corruption in government. It's kind of a big thing at that time. So magically, it's always these things just at the same time, but just happens that, wow, we're going to clean up the Federal Election Campaign Act. It existed before, but it was a pretty small thing, didn't do a lot. And so this all goes down. Nixon resigns, gets pardoned. Gerald Ford comes in, says we need to clean things up. So he says, we're going to send this new law that cleans up corruption in government, and we're going to really limit the amount of money that can go into candidates and elections. And so, and it was on the basis that it would help root out corruption, because money, the theory is, corrupts. If it's being paid to politicians for favors, things like that. So, curious just on that note, what do you think about the claim or the basis that money corrupts politicians? Do you think there's validity to that? Do you think there's some situations where maybe it doesn't? I'm curious what your thoughts might be with that.
Generally, I would think that it's an opening for conflicts of interest to arise. It's like if you have a candidate that is taking money from a particular business interest, then they would going to be more inclined to pass legislation that would be in support of that particular business interest, even if it might be against the public good.
Okay. So the potential that they make decisions based on their donors as opposed to the public good. Anyone else have thoughts or opinions, money in politics?
Word on the street, for as long as I can remember, if it was ever discussed wherever I was at, it would be that, money governs the politicians, and that whoever gives the most amount of money is the person that gets what he wants through a politician.
Okay. So we have that word on the street, like you say. I've never been a politician, so people haven't offered me money to do these things. I can't speak from first-hand experience.
Well, they offer you money to do your job.
They do.
They're expecting you to present a certain point of view. You're incented to present that point of view.
So advocate, right?
Money doesn't necessarily corrupt, but it does seem to put an obligation on a person.
Okay. Now, I will say, in my defense, I have turned down a lot of clients that I didn't agree with. But yes. But there are a lot of things that I go, would I normally be doing this? Absolutely not, but I'm doing it because someone's paying me, right? But it wasn't a moral conflict for me, but it was still something I would normally do. It's someone paid me, and so it's okay. Well, I'll go do it because that's all what we do. We trade our time for money, right? And to some level, we all do that.
I think money's a tool that has to be handled correctly. And so I think it takes big shoes to handle it correctly though, because it does, you have, like, if someone gives you something, you do feel a requirement to kind of have an exchange.
Yeah, I guess the fine line between giving a free contribution and a donation with no strings attached versus time for sale.
Yeah.
So true.
And how many of you trust your current politicians to not be for sale?
Just hope everybody that's in government.
Just in general. There may be a couple that you trust, but just in general. Do you have a strong trust for the government officials currently? Or not? Eliza, did you have something?
Sure. So with like the money, corrupting the politicians, is I think for a lot of them it can, but then I think it also depends on the politician and like where their moral standards stand. So I think there are a lot of politicians that won't like take bribery, and so I think there are a lot of politicians out there that won't do things like that. I mean, they will think up perhaps around anyway, you know what? Yeah.
Yeah. So we need to elect people that won't be bought, right?
Yeah.
I think that
Why that's the system itself, it just feeds into the problem because I was told by a lobbyist that actually about 70% of the time of members in politics are campaigning for money for the next election.
Mhm.
About 70% of their time is taken around money from this whole.
And especially if you're in the House of Representatives, you have to be elected every 2 years. So it gets a little bit longer. Whilst they're running consistently. Yeah.
So is the purpose to have a new vote, or is the purpose to be able to buy advertising time? And how do they use that?
Yeah, so you're talking about the expenditure of the actual funds, right? Yeah, but let's say that I went and advertised for, who's running, let's say I go advertise for Mike Lee, who's running, and I just run an ad, put a lot of money into it. It's New York Times front page, or Deseret News front page, or KSL, whatever. Even though I didn't give the money to Mike, the question becomes, does he feel any more obligation to do something for me back because I did something for him? And so there's still this question about what does the expenditure do, and to what extent does it corrupt politics or the system? Because one question is, well, what would happen if there was no money involved in politics? Nobody would do it. Nobody would do it. Nobody would do it. Well, even let's even say the politician got paid for their time, but meaning they just had a public radio they could speak on. No one had to pay to speak on it. They ran for office. No one was allowed to run ads. We just lived in a society where there wasn't money. Would there still be corruption issues?
Of course, because people are people, and there would be something else that would take the place of the money.
Okay.
There would be influence. There would be promise of a position after the fact. There could be other things there could be blackmail. There could be lots of things that motivate. So it doesn't eliminate corruption. It eliminates maybe money as a way to corrupt, but I don't know that it would eliminate corruption.
Okay.
It would limit how money could corrupt, because you could still use a political position for financial gain. You just wouldn't be able to do it through marketing strategies, basically.
But so you had said there could be a conflict of interest where you're now voting on something because there's a private interest involved. But here in our Utah government, we have a lot of real estate developers that run for office. And the whole prison site, how many people feel that was conflict of interest free? At least from what I see on all the comment sections, very few people believe that that was just a genuine, we care about Utah type move, and was more to enrich a bunch of developers. Now, what it was or wasn't, I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know people's hearts and intents, but from the outside, it looks bad.
Yeah.
And how do you, though, if you run for office, how do you separate out all your conflicts of interest too? So it is still this interesting thing where we talk about, yeah, money can persuade you to vote for something, but your religion can persuade you to vote for something. And that was one of the big things. Heber City had a hearing because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints proposed a temple up right in the middle of Heber. The residents wanted to keep their dark sky. They felt it was too big for the area and too bright at night. And so there was a lot of very animated hearings on it at the city council, and a number of people got up and asked all members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that served on the council to recuse themselves, saying they had a conflict of interest. And all of them refused to and said, no, it's not a conflict of interest. But I look at that, and I'm a member of that church, but I look at that and say, I think they have a really valid point. There is a very tightly entwined interest there. And at what point is it a conflict of interest? At what point isn't it? If you're there voting, because if you're a member of the church that wants to build a temple, your church, no.
That's where you say, okay, everybody, let's pray in unity and see what we get. Because God's in charge,
Yeah,
not
so
everybody believes that.
bring prayer to the city councils.
Absolutely.
The Supreme Court's a big issue.
And the Supreme Court. So they don't have, there's been a lot of conflicts happen. So for example, one of the cases I point to on the conflict side of the Supreme Court is Justice Thomas, who's deemed very conservative. He represented a company called Monsanto for a while. He then gets to the Supreme Court. Monsanto has a case come to the Supreme Court about whether you can patent corn seeds. So Monsanto was genetically modifying corn seeds. And what was happening is these genetically modified, so if farmers planted the genetically modified corn, it grows up, and then a farmer next to them has their corn and it grows up. Monsanto, as part of their patent, has a license that you can't save your own seeds. You have to read mine from Monsanto every year. And the farmers fields next to them, they would harvest their own seeds, save on the cost of buying new seeds, and they'd replant these seeds. But when a Monsanto field and a normal field was planted next to each other, they'd cross-pollinate, and then you'd have patented DNA in the new seed that was created by this corn. And so the Monsanto attorneys were going around suing all the farmers that were keeping their own seeds, saying you can't because that's patented. It doesn't have our patent in it. And this case goes up to the Supreme Court, and Justice Thomas issues the opinion. It says, yeah, you can patent that, and you can stop those farmers from collecting their own seeds because that's your patent that cross-pollinated. Now, is that a conflict of interest? Maybe, maybe not. Again, he worked there a long time ago. Is he still get money from him? I don't know.
Well, was he the only one that voted?
No, there was other ones that voted for it, but he was the author of the opinion and he did not recuse himself. Now, would it have changed the outcome? Maybe not. But just to the point of conflicts, we're learning that these justices are taking really expensive trips. They're getting RVs given to them, $300,000 RVs, different things.
But also,
There's no oversight.
Monsanto has been banned from Europe and Mexico.
Well, don't worry, Monsanto got bought out. They're now fair, right?
What is it?
Fair, like
Yeah, they're
after.
Yeah, the pharmaceutical company bought out the food. I see.
so they're all in bed with each other.
But again, just to say, there's a lot of gifts. We even look at our own Attorney General. He took an all expense paid trip to the World Cup in Dubai, or was it? And the public finds out after the fact and kind of going, who's paying for you to fly to Dubai and stay in really nice hotels? Why? And he says, not talking about it. And then KSL says, well, can we get a copy of your calendar? And it goes to the Public Records Request Committee, and they say, yeah, you got to give them your calendar. That's public records. And he says, no, I'm not going to do it. And so it's in district court right now. KSL's trying to get his calendar, and he doesn't want to disclose it. But again, we have these things. And so, but even without money, again, the question would be, can we avoid conflicts?
Conflict or conflict of interest?
Conflict of interest. Can we avoid conflicts of interest? Yeah. It's an interesting thing to think about. But Buckley versus Vallejo says money's the big one. We're going to attack money. So Buckley is a crazy long case. If you read it, there were a lot of separate provisions attacked in the law. It was a very comprehensive sweeping reform. But some of the things it did is it said, we're limiting the amount a person like me can donate to a candidate. Because we don't want candidates to be able to be bought off with really large donations. They limited expenditures by individuals that were, quote, relative to a clearly identified candidate. So if I ran an ad in the paper and said, I love Biden, whatever, there were limits on what I could spend relative to a clearly identified candidate, even if I didn't give them the money. There were limits on amounts a candidate could spend from his personal or family funds. And there were requirements that political committees keep detailed records of contributions and expenditures. So you had talked about the political action committees, the PACs, we call them. And they had to keep names of people that donated. They also were supposed to track the profession of the person that donated, where they lived, a number of things. They were all public information to disclose. And so the theory is, on the disclosure side, that the public can then look and see who's donating to a candidate, where their interests may lie, and choose whether they vote for them or not. That's the theory. Now, again, there was a lot more in this case, way more things going on, including the creation of the Federal Election Commission, the appointment of members. The Supreme Court went through, and it was very detailed analysis of this is good, this is bad, this is good, this is bad kind of thing. And it was very, it was all over the place what the result was from this. But the claim from these individuals, so these individuals that sued, there were politicians that sued, sitting politicians that voted against it. There were political parties involved that sued. There were political action committees, other things that had sued. And they all were in the same case at the Supreme Court. And so the government always has to argue for a justification, has to explain to the court what they call, when they limit speech, they have to say what their compelling interest is. So the government, if it has a compelling interest in the court's view, then they can override the constitutional protections. And so I'm curious what you think what justifications might exist or might support some of these restrictions that they had in here. Or that they even argue to support. You don't have to agree with it necessarily. What do you think the government would say their compelling interest is?
Truth.
They have truth? And they'd say money doesn't let us have truth, potentially. We want to promote truth. And we'll actually see that Utah has that interest stated in its law. In its actual current day law.
Like clear, what's the word?
Transparency.
Transparency.
Okay, transparency.
Transparency. Then there's also there's the concern that said, okay, well, if only people who can amass large amounts of money, well, there's the concern that only people with large amounts or access to large amounts of funds would be able to get elected because they would be able to drown out any other opposition. So that those with more money would automatically be the ones who are having power.
You guys have all named things the government has articulated so far, so good job. You shall be lawyers. These are all rationales that have been put out. Any other thoughts? What may justify these limits?
Kinds of reward. National defense for it.
Okay, and we saw that a little bit last time, for sure, where there was the clear and present danger that they talked about. Yeah.
Protecting its citizens against nefarious plots to have laws made that were not in the public's interest.
Okay. So protecting the citizens against these plots, that's something that's coming from the whole Watergate scandal, right? We see that there was a plot for power and people were hoodwinked and they voted for this guy that maybe they wouldn't have voted for if they had known. And so we want more disclosure, we want these
In
things.
2020 with the laptop.
And so we have all kinds of allegations floating currently on all sides. It'll be fascinating to see how some of these shake out and how the history views it. Let's see. I had one question for you. It was left my mind, so it must not be too important. So ultimately in Buckley. Oh, sorry. This is a question that came back to me. Do you know why the states in the U.S. passed the amendment that said that senators were voted directly by the people? So states used to appoint the 2 senators that went because the Senate was to represent the states. And so senators were appointed by the states in the early 1900s. 75% of the states at least agreed, we don't want to do this anymore, just let the Senate be elected by the people. Do any of you know why the states walked away from that appointment ability and passed that in?
On the face of it, why? Or like why they said that they?
Yeah, the stated reasons why all the states said they did.
Was it their concern that the controlling political party of the state would pick the senator that would best represent their points of view?
It wasn't. Because that was what they really liked about it. Because again, the Senate was supposed to be a check. You had the House of Representatives to represent the people, the Senate to represent the state, and the theory was the federal government would never get too big because the states wouldn't like it, they'd vote no. And it had to be something that both the people and the states wanted, which would be a check and balance. But they eventually said, we don't want this anymore. Let's get rid of it and just make it all directly elected by the people. And it's because they claim that the process had become so dirty with money and bribes to determine who would be elected as senators. And it was such an ugly thing for the states to deal with, and there was so much money and nefarious conduct involved that they eventually said, wow, this is going to be way outrageous, let's pass this new amendment. That's the claim.
So the spending went way up.
And so it's just to say that from the perspective of word on the street, America's been dealing with this issue of money very much controlling. If you go back to the history books and look at the Rockefeller times, oil and Carnegie and those, they draw this, the cartoons of the day draw this octopus that goes out from their headquarters with its tentacles around Washington, D.C. You know, it says that it's controlling everything to the place.
Tammany Hall in Park. Tammany Hall was a seat of corruption in the city, leaders of New York City.
Yeah. And then we had unions come along, and there was all kinds of corruption money issues with those for a while. We don't hear about that, the union side, anywhere near as much anymore. But there was some pretty serious stuff going on. So again, America has been dealing with a lot of money in politics. They've seen some of the results of it. And so ultimately, the Supreme Court, when they look at this, they say, yeah, we can limit the amount of speech that's available to someone based on a compelling interest of fighting corruption. And so ultimately, the Buckley case stands for the proposition that we can limit speech to fight corruption. Now, that is a premise that's there's been so many court cases on this since we could spend weeks and weeks on all the cases. But it's one to think about. If we think about our balance that we had, if we have a state of anarchy and there's just no laws, no restrictions, no regulations, it's just a free for all, people by politicians, no laws against bribery, anything, there might be some problems with that and maintaining a country. But on the flip side, what does corruption mean? How do we see that play out? And if you can justify anything under corruption, what can you limit? And so that's where the test really started to come in. So with things like this, individual contributions to candidates, the Supreme Court said, yeah, those could corrupt. So you can limit those. So currently in America, the limits are still in place, and you have limits of what you can donate to a federal candidate for office as an individual. You can't donate more than a certain amount. And you can donate that to all kinds of individual candidates. There's restrictions on how much you can donate to a political party. And we're going to talk a little bit more about even why would politicians vote for this. And it gets to be interesting to actually see some of what starts to happen with the impact of these things. But individual expenditures to support a candidate. The court said, if someone's just out saying something and they're not giving the money to the candidate, they said, we don't think that's close enough to corrupt them. And so can't limit that. And they didn't allow those limits to stay in place. So people could still spend what they wanted independent of the candidate. Candidates spending their own funds. What do you think the Supreme Court said about whether that corrupts a candidate or not? If you look back to Mitt Romney, I don't know if any of you know what he put in his campaign, but that answers the question. Supreme Court said, someone's own money can't corrupt them. No one's buying anything with that. So you can't limit what a candidate spends their own funds. And so Mitt Romney, I think, put over $200 million into his presidential campaign of his own funds. That's a lot. That is a lot of money. And do any of you know what they're projected to spend on this next presidential election? Any guesses?
$1 billion.
Sure. More than that. $10 billion. $10 billion is what they're projected to spend on this next election. Presidential election. Just the presidential part.
Could you kind of go around that and say, I'll give you, well, I won't give you money for your campaign, but because you run this, I'm going to pay your business $1 billion.
I'll hire your business as a consultant. How about that?
Yeah.
Will you come consult with me for a few minutes and I'll pay you $100,000 to your business?
I don't know. It seems like possibility.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Do any of you think there's any ways to circumvent these?
Yes.
The answer is yes. It's pretty easy for anyone that wants to. Because yes. So what does Trump do, right? Trump has a lot of businesses. How do you get money to Trump if you're limited on your $3,500 or whatever you can donate to him? Do business with him. Right? Go golf at his golf club and pay whatever to go to the golf club. There's all kinds of things that happen. And yes, one of the things that happens, even if you look at here in Utah, you can hire any one of our elected officials to do business for you. They can be a real estate agent. You can do all kinds of things. And you're not paying them for a campaign. So it's a good question. And it's an important point to remember. But the Supreme Court said, no, you can't restrict candidates spending your own funds. Your own funds don't corrupt them. But again, to the point, well, that makes a loophole here.
Was that where the term dirty money came into place when politicians started doing their thing?
We have laundering money. We launder the dirty money to clean it up.
They're using their own soap.
And that's a whole other discussion. Next month, we're going to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act. It's meant to fight laundering money by targeting small business owners. It's a new one. I can tell you how companies launder money. It's not that hard. Oh, sorry. I missed one point here. Disclosure of income and expenses from political committees. The Supreme Court said, yeah, that's a good way to fight corruption. Transparency, shine the light, It doesn't stop anyone from speaking. They can still say what they want. They just got to disclose it. Go ahead. So we get this new kind of system that kicks in America after the Supreme Court takes its stab at nuclear. And maybe you're getting to this because you talk a lot about how the laws follow the morality of society, and I've heard people push back on that when you talk about that at times. And so I'm curious, is there a technical definition of corruption here? Because I don't know how you have corruption without morality. And if the Supreme Court is making decisions on corruption, again, I don't know, maybe there's a technical definition, but to me that sounds like morality. Yeah, it's a great question. There is no definition in the law. And that's why I even say, what does corruption mean? And it's a good point, because if we don't think it's an issue for a politician to do a certain thing because it's part of the morality of the day, it won't be corruption. But 40 years later, it might be, but it wasn't then. And corruption is very much defined by morality. And even the Supreme Court, when they look at this and say, what's the compelling interest? They're saying, what's the moral basis for this? What's the moral justification for this law, and is this supportable? And so the Supreme Court always in a constitutional case is looking at a moral question. And the Constitution even says in the Constitution it's the supreme law of the land, that every judge that looks at a constitutional issue then says, they ask two questions. They ask, one, does it actually violate the Constitution? So, for example, in Buckley, the Supreme Court would say, does this limit speech? Does it abridge speech? And they answer that question and say, yeah, these things do. So then the second question is, but what's the justification, and do we allow it? And so the Constitution from the beginning has never been the actual supreme law of the land. It's always been the moral code of the nation that these justices appeal to in deciding what ultimately is allowed or not allowed, even under the Constitution. And so just remember that term compelling interest is saying what's the moral basis. Is it a strong enough moral basis to allow us to override the Constitution? And so here they said, yep, it is. But to your point about definition, it's not. And that's why I would look at it and say, well, is it corrupt for me to work for money? Is it corrupt for someone to vote on something because of money?
If you were to set a definition for corruption legally, a great deal of corruption would stem from that.
We'd all be able to head into corruption, probably.
So then it all boils down to us and where we stand on the morality issue.
Well, as a society, it's kind of a collective sense of what society tolerates and permits. So we permit me as an attorney to take money because someone paid me. But do we permit a politician to take money to vote or not? How does that look? We've tolerated it as a society for quite a while. There is some level we've tolerated where we haven't said that our politicians have to quit their day jobs, and so they can still have those conflicts of interest, at least at the state level. California has a full-time Congress. Their elected representatives are in making laws full-time. That's a whole other can of worms. If your only job is to make laws, there's a reason California is struggling, I think. But so then Citizens United is a case that comes along, and if you remember back when Hillary was running for president, this was 2008, and this group called Citizens United, they're a nonprofit group, nonprofit corporation. They didn't like Hillary, and so they did a 90-minute documentary. They wanted to expose all the bad reasons, or all the bad things about Hillary, all the reasons not to vote for her. And they make the movie, documentary, put it out. They eventually get a contract with a video-on-demand cable service where someone can pay to watch it, kind of a pay-per-view type thing. And so they wanted to run ads to let everyone know about the movie they made. But they're within a 60-day window of an election. And at the time, FICA, this act, it gets amended often. It banned any expenditure, any any company was not allowed to use their own funds to run ads about politicians in the 60-day window before an election. They could form a PAC, they could form a political action committee, they could give some money to the PAC, and then the PAC could run the ads, but the PAC was subject to extreme disclosure requirements. And it costs a decent amount of money. So currently in America, I think if you talk to most attorneys, I don't know currently what it is with inflation. Back when I worked in campaign finance, they'd say it was about $25,000 to set up a PAC at the federal level, with the laws and things you have to comply with. So Citizens United says, this is a joke. We're a small group of people. We need to have our voice heard. We want to run our ads. And so they sue, arguing that this law shouldn't apply to them. They actually argued that FICA shouldn't apply to them based on their status and what they were doing, because the video on demand was something people could opt into. It wasn't something they would just see. I don't know, they had some different arguments. But looking at the Citizens United case, and I guess one thing to put in background-wise with Citizens United, when Citizens United came down in 2010, President Obama called it the worst decision since the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a case that ruled that slaves were pretty essentially enough. So it was a sad decision in the history of America, but he said it's the worst case since the Dred Scott decision. And the reason that Obama and others were so upset about it was because in 1990, the Supreme Court had a separate case called Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce. And they ruled in that case that corporate independent expenditures, so they're not giving them to a candidate, they're spending them on their own. They ruled that they could ban those completely. And they said, yeah, it's totally fine because corporations have, they can corrupt things, they have all kinds of money. So just ban corporate speech, we're good with that. And so Citizens United was going, well, they already have that case. So they were trying to create a little narrow exception to the Austin case. And when the Supreme Court looked at it, so they get the briefing, get the arguments, they go through and look at it, and they actually send back to the parties and say, we need more briefing. You need to tell us if you should overrule the Austin case or not. That wasn't something that was specifically sought for. They kind of mentioned it a little bit in lower courts, but not specifically. And this is because a little bit after the Buckley case that we just looked at, there was another case that came up, First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti. And in that one, they had banned independent corporate expenditures on ballot issues. So these would be things that the people are voting on the ballot, as opposed to a candidate. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't ban corporations from talking about ballot issues. It's not okay. And so you have Bellotti saying you can't stop a corporation from talking about ballot issues. You have Austin saying that you can stop a corporation from talking about candidates. And the Bellotti ruling stated, if the speakers here were not corporations, no one would suggest that the state could silence their proposed speech. Because again, it's a total ban. You can't talk. It is the type of speech indispensable to decision-making in a democracy, and this is no less true because the speech comes from a corporation rather than an individual. The inherent worth of the speech, in terms of its capacity for informing the public, does not depend upon the identity of whether corporation, association, union, or individual. So curious to know your thoughts on that. Is corporate speech just as valuable as individual speech? Walmart, Target, Apple. Or do you think there's differences?
If you are going to label Walmart as the same type of entity as a 5-person corporation, or it's a very broad category that doesn't really have the flexibility necessary to deal with real life situations.
Okay. And I appreciate that because do any of you know do you know the percent of corporations in America that make less than $1 million a year?
96%.
96%. You do know the percent. Good job.
I read what you sent out.
You read under great. So yeah, to this category, 96% of corporations in America make less than $1 million gross revenue. So believe we haven't broken the $1 million thing yet. You know, we're this little corporation moving along, but am I the same? If Believe talks about something, if I go to the legislature and say, hey, Believe's position on this is X, is that the same as Walmart coming in and telling him what their position is? And Austin here is saying, this is a wide disparity because it's almost apples and oranges. You can't compare a corporation just from corporation alone. But any other thoughts on that?
Yes, if I worked for Apple and they're voting Democrat and I'm a Republican, and they said it's an imposition on my freedom,
Okay.
really, because people that work for Apple, then assumptions could be made,
Yeah.
It really is conflict of interest.
Yeah, so then there's this interesting thing, and this is something that the government brought up in the Citizens United case when they're arguing for this to be upheld. It said, hey, what about all the shareholders? If Apple's speaking, you're gonna have a lot of shareholders that don't agree, actual owners of the company that don't agree, but a lot that do. And so they're saying we shouldn't let them talk because it conveys false impressions.
Isn't that the same thing that happened with Disney when they, with the state of Florida and the Reedy Creek district, the stock price of Disney went down as a result of all the contention and everything that was a result of them getting involved. And they were saying you're not supporting or representing the stakeholders or the shareholders. You're doing it for some other reason, and your reason for being in business is to make us money. That's why we invest in your company.
Yeah. So the shareholders say that and say, I only buy you because you're supposed to make us money. That's your job. And now you took a political stance and it's hurting us. We lost our whole special district here, right? And yeah, and I imagine my bet is there's lawsuits playing out in court over the Disney fiasco about whether they can say these things or not.
There's also allegation that big tech companies or the social media platforms would limit the amount of speech that's coming from some groups, and then having algorithms that only focus on news stories or letting news stories come through that are beneficial for other groups.
Yeah. Yeah, and not just big tech. Do you know who else got proven to be doing that? Yeah, what branch of the government? It's the IRS. The IRS, they get all these 501c3 and nonprofit applications in, and they'd approve all the liberal ones and they deny the conservative ones.
Are you kidding?
They got caught for it. They got busted for it. It was widespread enough that they actually had proof that they were doing this and denying conservative nonprofit applications. And so they had this shake up and clean up whatever in the IRS now.
Which really isn't new. They had the newspaper syndicates for years, and now it's going to much quicker now.
Yep.
It's very fast.
Yep. So newspapers were an issue. Again, it'll be fun to look at Utah Law. Utah Law talks about newspapers. Getting into the press stuff. But it is interesting because when we talk about banning corporate speech, we could silence the voice of any group of 2 or 3 people if we ban corporate speech completely. Because if 2 or 3 people come together, they create something outside themselves. We're a group now. We've got a name, we've got a voice. And there's this freedom to assemble in America and petition the government. And so it creates this interesting conflict. Well, and the other, maybe this goes into it, but a corporation might not be able to directly make a statement or donate or something, but I've been a part of plenty of companies that a memo goes to the company to say, hey, this is something that affects all of us. You all should go and support
something.
our position,
Yeah.
Which, again, at the surface, I'm like, well, I think you should be able to, because laws can really change your whole industry, and then all of a sudden you're out of a job or whatever. It makes it a lot harder. But with the way things are, even for us, when we post for Believe, as soon as you pay money to run an ad, they won't show your things to even the people who follow you anymore.
Unless you pay them again.
Unless you pay them again. And so we've experienced that where you run an ad and then nobody sees your stuff anymore unless you pay again. And so even that is a small, again, even for a small firm, that's like, well, if you don't have money, you can't play. But
Yeah.
so I don't know. If there was a way to create it where there wasn't the tech that was influencing like what voices got put out, I would be more supportive of an argument that says, corporations should be able to speak of their interests. But when they can silence so many other voices, that's where it feels it isn't right.
And it's one of these funny places we're in America to say we rely on mostly to let our voice be heard. And so we have this really interesting partnership taking place where there's this integral middleman between us speaking because we don't get together in our big groups or town halls or whatever. And speech is the right disseminated to all of America. But that right is controlled by an intermediary, which is private, which isn't bound by the Constitution. And then we get into these funny
Wasn't that
questions.
230? Isn't that where they are trying to say you can either be a publisher or you need your platform? You either need, if you're the publisher, then you do have editorial rights to what you publish. But if you're saying that you're a platform, then you should not have any restrictions on the speech that you carry. And they want, it seems to me that those tech platforms want it both ways. They want to be perceived as one way, but actually live and work as another.
And well, though, there is something really sad about the state of our country and society, and that is that if a private company does not censor at all, what happens to the platform? It turns into pornography. Every platform is just total pornography shared. If you go to an uncensored platform, it's just sharing pornography all over the place.
Facebook spends quite a lot.
Facebook spends incredible amounts of money trying to remove pornography so that people will stay on Facebook. People post it nonstop.
What about with Rumble? Is that considered a pornography site?
Well, so every site that still has users that's not gun pornography censors for pornography. And this is the issue with classifying someone as a publisher versus a platform. Platform says, oh, we just let people post whatever, so don't hold us liable for it. But they've been pushing that boundary because they're starting to remove content. And then now there's this issue, well, you didn't remove this content and it was violent or it promoted something, and so you should be held liable for it. And this is where this rules change is proposed to say, well, pick one, be a platform or be a publisher. And I go, there's no way as a private company you can pick one because you have to remove content if you want to stay relevant to people. Because there's so much disgusting content that people share and put out that no one wants to see it. You have to censor it. Facebook employs hundreds to thousands of people in Africa that sit there and review all the pornographic content, all the violent rapes that are posted, all kinds of things, and they remove them. And these people get super messed up. And it's the cost of having a platform that you can get onto and see pornography on.
So then explain. So I saw something the other day on my phone and I'm like, you know how these things will come across the top of whatever.
Yeah,
It's not tech savvy, but here you've got something that your son sent, and then you've got something that your daughter-in-law sent, and then you've got this other thing that's like, wow.
Yep.
and I don't know how to get it off. I don't touch it because I don't want it to
Go to
produce
something.
more.
Yeah.
And I don't know how all this works, but it's like, do they get fined with that kind of stuff?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. You can have some really bad ads come through. That's up to the service you're using, up to people that hack your phone, people that download software.
Am I doing something to promote that coming into my phone?
You're using your phone.
Oh dear.
So bad things, people try and push it to everyone and everything. So there's some group out there, some people, some numerous groups that try and get you to feed you bad things. They'll do everything they can to circumvent what you have on your phone and get stuff to you. There's companies that allow them to advertise and just have bad ads pop up. But that's the site's choice, and they can censor again or not and say, we don't want this type of content because it's too offensive. We want people to stay. Or some choose to allow it because it makes a lot of money. And so there's some web pages, if you visit the web page or use the app, some apps permit some pretty bad things to come through. So sometimes you have to pick a different app. Sometimes ad blockers work, sometimes they don't, depending on the service. But these are things that it's a fascinating conundrum of, and again, if you're Facebook, let's just say it's me, I just own Facebook, and they're posting videos of civilians being beheaded in the country, and I go, I don't want that on here. Pull it down. And I pull it down. Am I now a publisher that is now liable for not pulling down some other violent video that came up because I pulled one down? And that's what's happening to these companies is they pull one down that's really bad. And then everyone sues them and says, well, you should have pulled all these other things down too. And look what happened. And because of you, it stayed up and it made it worse and hold them liable. And we're in this fascinating battle right now of, well, what do we do? And Facebook's kind of like, we're a platform. People post things here. And people are saying, but you pulled something else down. So now you got to exercise due care in what you choose to pull down or not pull down. And it's a fascinating moral issue of, well, what do we do? I just couldn't tell your hand there. Okay. So with this, going back to Citizens United, we have two conflicting lines of precedent Supreme Court feels. They feel that the Austin case that kind of came out of nowhere in 1990, they have this Bellotti case from 1978. And ultimately, the Supreme Court chooses to overrule Austin, which angered a lot of people because they overturned precedent, but they're going to overturn one of the precedents. And they said, you can't ban corporate speech just because it comes from a corporation or association. You can't make a speech. But they said in the same breath, you can require that they disclose and do all the same things that PAC does. And it was fascinating in the Citizens United case, the Supreme Court listed all the onerous burdens on a PAC and why you couldn't make a corporation be a PAC. And they were all disclosure based. Oh, they have to do this disclosure, they have to do that disclosure, they have to do all these things if they're a PAC. So you can't make them be a PAC. But you can make them disclose whatever you want. And they literally say this in the same breath in this case. Well, not the same breath. They did take a breath, I guess, but they do their first part and they do their second part. And so the firm I was at, and so this came out in 2010 when I graduated from law school. The firm I was at said, oh, all these states have requirements that corporations form PACs. And I said, it's unconstitutional under Citizens United. We're going to sue. So they went to all these states and sued. And all the state governments came in and said, oh, that Citizens United case, it says that we can require disclosures. All that we're doing with the PAC is requiring disclosures. And judges did not strike down these PAC requirements in all these states because they said, oh, it's just disclosures. It's all good. And so it's fascinating because the actual impact of Citizens United, and I've actually seen some articles that say, yeah, Citizens United didn't produce the results that people thought it would. And it's largely because, again, a corporation could speak before if they formed the PAC and then spoke through the PAC. And so now they can speak, but they still have to disclose everything like a PAC. And it still costs money to speak. It still requires attorneys and all these things to be involved. So this $1 million lower corporations, 96% of them, they're still not speaking because they can't pay the attorneys to do their compliance for them and file the reports and things. So I just want to jump ahead real quick to Utah law. I don't know if you can see it here or not. It's a little bit small. This is Utah campaign and financial reporting requirements for corporations. If you're a corporation and you've spent at least $750, you have to file 5 different financial statements. On January 10th, 7 days before the state political convention, 7 days before the regular primary election, on September 30th, and 7 days before the regular general election date, the corporation shall report detailed listing of all expenditures made. All expenditures as of 5 days before the required filing date of the financial statement, whatever.
For political purposes, or
Yes, and these are expenditures for political purposes. Expenditure, this term, expenditures, it says expenditures for political purposes. Those terms are defined. The definitions still don't help you a lot, but they are defined. And then if you're a corporation that has a contract with the state, is bidding on a contract for, or has bid, is currently bidding, or has a contract with the state, you have to disclose things too. And so that's so that people can supposedly see if you're bidding to try and get, or you're spending money to try and get secure a contract with the state.
So when you say people, whatever you just said about people, how many people really go in to look at that kind of stuff? Because a lot of people bury their heads in the sand.
Do you know what percent of America knows this exists?
Probably 0, right?
It'd be very close to 0. Do you know what percent of attorneys know this exists?
3.
Less than 1% of attorneys know this exists. I've had situations where people come and say, "Oh, we're going to go do this. We're going to run this ad against my plea or whatever," and I go, "Well, okay, but do you know all the laws you have to comply with?" And they look at me and go, "This is America. We have freedom of speech. I don't comply with anything." And I go, "Oh no, you want to? There's a law at stake, and violation of these laws is a felony, generally."
But if it's against the corporation, how do they put a corporation in jail?
It's a great question. They go up to the officers that are in charge of it. And so you can go to jail. I'm trying to think of the case right now where that's happening. Trump's people, obviously, his CFO and others are in trouble for some of the criminal stuff with the Trump organization. But there was another one where I don't remember what it is. It'll come back to me. But yes. But yeah, so the last meeting, so someone even went and asked their son, who was an attorney at a big firm, and he said, "That's silly. There's no such thing." And he came back to me and said, "And my son said you're crazy." I said, "Well, have him look at these laws." And I sent the laws, and then comes back and he goes, "Oh, says that I got to talk to his partner out in New York, the only one in the firm that handles this." So this is a big firm, 1,000+ attorneys, I think, and there was one attorney that handles this stuff in the firm. So a very small percent even know it exists. And
he wasn't as busy as the other lawyers?
the one,
I'm
sure he was busy, but there was just one, they only needed one to do it because no one did the compliance, right?
Lots of rabbit holes, my gosh.
But so this, in the cases I represented a mom in Texas. Well, not me directly, the firm I was at. She was being charged with violating the Texas campaign finance laws. And what she had done is she went down to the polls one day, and her statement was that she watched as these old people would go, "I don't know what to do with this." It was the hand-filled ballots at the time. And they would say, "Oh, you just circle this this bubble right here." And they were telling these old people who to vote for. And so she became very about that. That's a crime for a ballot worker to tell you who to vote for. And so she formed a group to watch the polls. And they would go, everyone's can watch the election workers make sure they're telling people who to vote for. And at one of their meetings, they passed around a cowboy hat, collected money so they could continue to grow and spread their word. And then they spent some money, and it wasn't disclosed to Texas because they know about it. And she at the time was facing 10 years in jail.
How much money was involved? My gosh.
We're talking a cowboy hat with some cash in it. That's what we're talking about. So in that case, I write a brief that was over 100 pages long. It was longer. But there was a lot in Texas law. Texas law is fascinating. We look at Texas as a conservative state generally, but when it comes to campaign finance, Texas bans all political speech except for what the law allows. Wild. The presumption in America is all speech is allowed unless the government can justify why it has to be banned. Texas just says it's all banned unless you can find it listed in here as allowable. I've never seen such a blanket crazy law. That's good old Texas. So yeah, this stuff. One of the things that happens to churches sometimes is someone goes to the church, copies a bunch of papers, and then goes and distributes flyers after using the church copier. And churches will get charged with violating campaign finance laws. No joke. Because they contributed now to the dissemination of things, their funds and whatever.
So how do they know that they're using the church copier?
I don't know how these things come to the government's attention, but there have been cases. There was one in Montana where a small church, someone went and copied a small church and they got caught up in this. And I don't know, it gets a little wild. Utah, when we look at Utah's laws, Utah's are very tame compared to other states. Utah's are some of the easiest to comply with in the nation. We don't do a lot of campaign finance here.
So what if they use like team codes or home office, whatever?
You're paying for that, so it's not a donation or contribution by the company. Now it's on you as the person. But if the church didn't charge for the copies, they're now contributing.
So does it mean, sorry, I'm really naive to a lot of stuff. Does it mean then that, I was going to say,
No worries, welcome back. So one of the things, and I think it was you that had mentioned this, kind of corporations can have such an overwhelming voice if they have tons of money. It can kind of distort the field, you could say. You talked about truth. And in the Austin case, the Supreme Court had upheld the complete ban on corporate speech, on independent corporate speech, on this justification of saying, yeah, we don't want to distort the field too much. So much money coming into something distorts it too much and makes it so that people can't sort through what's true or not true. Curious what you think of that rationale from the Supreme Court.
Well, wouldn't the same thing be true for PACs?
It would.
A large amount of enough money that they distort the truth as much as a corporation.
It would. Yep. And PACs are exempt from this.
how so?
PACs are allowed to spend money because they report their contributions. But yes,
Oh,
under the anti-distortion principle, when money in a PAC distort just as much as money in a corporation.
No, because they spent enough money to be able to disclose how they did that.
But it goes back to one of the questions, the Mitt Romney issue. If you have a Mitt Romney come along and spend $200 million,
That's disgusting.
does that distort the speech, the image, the ability to find truth? And so when the Supreme Court looked at this in Citizens United, they said, that anti-distortion principle was no good because it would affect the PACs, it would affect the individuals. We can't ban large amounts of money just for money's sake alone. It's got to go back to corruption only. So the anti-distortion rationale came in for a little bit, but then got kicked out again. And it's still currently there. But again, the Government Citizens United argued, what about the shareholders? Or that was you. What about the shareholders that don't agree? And the Supreme Court said, if they don't agree, they can go vote out the people that talked about it. And I go, well, that's true if a majority don't agree, but it's not true if a minority don't agree. But it is this, again, a conundrum, because if the government's coming out with a law that says we are going to ban all smartphones, should Apple be able to talk about that no matter how big they are? If the government comes out and says we're banning social media for children, should these companies be able to talk about it?
Is this rhetorical, or are you wanting a response?
If you want to respond, you're welcome to.
I
Or
think
just take a stab at that.
think if all the smartphones were taken away, and I don't have one. Mine just happens to be red, but it's not a smartphone. I don't think
It's a red phone.
It's just red, the color red. Anyway, Austin, you were so smart. I'm getting this, but I couldn't ever repeat it. So there would be a major revolution up here if people didn't have their smartphones.
Okay.
And
are we going to have a revolution when the youth don't have their social media?
Maybe a smaller revolution, but the youth grow up and they're getting to be quite involved in their own opinions, and what they want and what they don't want. I don't know.
But again, you have to always remember these principles from the perspective of, if they can do it to one person you don't agree with, or something you don't agree with, they can do it to something you do agree with. So that's one of the ways the law always works. If they can come out and just say, ban social media, and A, corporations, you can't say anything about it, because that's corrupting. Do we want that?
Or you can shut down whole industries if with a law like you're saying with phones. But I think to your question, I do feel the point of civil discourse is that both sides can't present themselves. So I think if they say we're going to ban social media, yes, Facebook should be able to come up and present their thoughts on it, as well as the person who says, my child has been bullied and is messed up because of social media. I mean, I think there should be able to have both sides presented.
So, but you're Facebook and you shut out all the people that talk about all the bad things with Facebook, and you just promote all the good things about Facebook, and that's all anyone sees.
Yeah.
What happens at that point?
Yeah, you're having.
And it's a great point. It's just one of these things of how do we get to that place?
Yeah.
Where both sides have a place.
You're having artificial intelligence, or companies that have artificial intelligence. You have regulations entering that market now, and that the concern would be that it would benefit the companies which already have large investments in that field, and would be able to push out smaller companies, or an open source version of the same thing. You just regulate the thing essentially.
Yeah.
So,
well, in the perfect world, it would be equal, right? Or would you have equal opportunity to share your voice in the perfect world? But we don't live in a world. Okay.
Well, the thing that I'm interested in, if this has ever even come up in any cases, is, forget a corporation, where all of the power and influence is right now is with influencers and YouTubers, and so, for example, if your platform's being threatened, all the influencers are going to be influencing. Yeah. And they could not even pay to have their stuff. They just have 200 million subscribers that see it. And so do they have to disclose, what do they disclose? They're just sharing their opinion. But that's where all the money is right now, is in viewership. That's where the eyeballs are. Yeah, we have all these influencers who have a lot of influence on America. And yeah, to your point, Hey government, I didn't even spend money on this. Go this president, or I'm pro this or pro that or whatever.
It comes
What
back to
starts to
one
happen?
of the earlier, our the more complex the society becomes and the more sophisticated we get in our ideation, the more flexible that the law needs to become to be able to adequately deal with reality that we actually have as a society. I mean, each time we end up bringing up one of these questions, it's like, all right, well, we've now defined something, or we've said it in law that this is right and this is wrong. And as soon as you throw that rock in the river, so to say, everything just kind of goes haywire. You can always find a workaround now that you've thrown that rock in, where now you can use that as a bridge point to be able to do whatever it was that you were doing before.
Or if you have someone against that rock that you threw in the water, how dare you try to control what I do or what I say or what I see?
Yep. And these are complex issues. I don't expect us to have the full answers right now, but to me, again, it goes back to this balance thing of saying we have to have some law to pull us out of anarchy. It can't just be the wild, wild west. But man, how do we balance it? And are we as a people taking on the morality necessary and responsibility necessary to sort through things, to look at things? Are we promoting that type of solution as well? So, just curious, the laws we've seen so far, bans on corporate speech, disclosures, do you think they help reduce corruption?
I think they alter how it happens.
Okay. So do you think it reduces it?
I don't think so.
I think that they just find another way around.
Okay. So if we have politicians and if I'm there and I rely on contributions to get in office, I've got to spend a bunch of money. And someone comes to me with a law and says, "Hey, Austin, I've got this great law. We're going to clean up our image. We're just going to cut off the money that people can give to you." What would make me want to vote for that?
And in return, you will get, it will be whatever other promise they can make.
You might be taking a look at the competition, and you might have a plan for being able to still receive campaign contributions in a different form
Okay.
that you don't think that your competition would be as capable.
So you're
Does
looking
that
at the
change
competition?
morality?
Potentially. Well, sorry. Depends on your definition of morality. Does it change
What's
true
right and what's
morality?
wrong?
No, it's not going to change what's right and wrong. But does it change our perception of it or society's view of it?
Sure.
Very much possible.
Is it true that a person that campaigns for office and they receive contributions, if they're not spent as an expense, that it goes into a bank account for them?
Yeah, personal use.
For them that when they actually retire, say if you wait for office and you're going to office repeatedly, anytime you don't spend all the campaign money, it goes into an account. And at the end of it, and they don't campaign anymore and they pull out of politics, that money is theirs, tax free.
It's not supposed to be. There's a lot of ways politicians get rich. Any politician in federal government, their financial holdings miraculously grow a whole lot while they're in office, a lot more than their paycheck. But the funds that come in for campaigns aren't supposed to be spent on personal use. There are restrictions on that.
They're not spent on personal use during the campaign,
Correct, even after.
even though
Yeah. They're not supposed to be. Does it happen? It happens quite a bit. There's some allegations about that with some people. George Santos, for example, has a bunch of issues. He just got kicked out of Congress, but he had personal use with his expenditures too.
So I'm a member of United Women's Forum, as well as many other groups. And we take time to vet the people that are campaigning, the candidates. We have them come to our meetings and talk about, and we're a powerful group. And I know for a fact that some of them walk out thinking, well, I just lied, or, somebody knows that I was just lying, and those are never my intentions. And so, is vetting good?
Vetting's great. Ways that people should activate that. Huge fan of that.
Yeah.
But you can read insider trading on stock.
Okay. So there are technically restrictions on insider trading. Do you know what they talked about with insider trading with the Israel war right now? So if you go back and look, there was a huge movement in stocks right before. They said it's pretty clear from the stock movement that people knew the war was about to happen.
Depends on which committees you serve on.
And we're talking people over in Israel, supposedly, that knew these things. But it goes back to, so talking about this thing about the competition, there are two groups in America who are not bound by any contribution limits to candidates. Do you have any idea who they are? Any guesses? What two groups would have no limits on contributions to candidates?
Nonprofits.
It's a good guess. It's not. Private member society. The Republican and Democrat. So the two parties in power say, "Oh yeah, we can restrict contributions to everyone. We can collect a whole lot of money, and we can give it to whoever we want." So you guys vote for this, or don't you? You vote for this because what does it do now? No person can challenge an incumbent because they can't raise the money. They're all limited in their cap. You're getting just a certain amount from each individual. The candidate is too, but then the candidate gets all this money in from the party.
So is it to parties in general, or is it literally just those two?
Just the two. You have to be a federally recognized political party. So there's only two. Federally recognized political party. And no third party has ever been able to make it as a nationally recognized third party.
So what could they do to become that? To be recognized?
It's a great question. There's a lot of people asking right now. Robert Kennedy would sure like to know. But with these laws in place, when we talk about fighting corruption, there's two groups that can give the candidates whatever they want. And it's the two groups that control the candidates. And if you have a third party that wants to come in, you can't raise the money, you can't compete, you get outspent, you get distorted, all kinds of things happening. And so there are many people that view, but out of the people that know about campaign finance laws, many of them view it as an incumbent protection law. Mm-hmm. And they don't view it as protecting corruption, they just view it as shifting where the corruption happens.
Right.
And so when we get into that with shifting where the corruption happens, we get into the legislative process. Ironically, we say we're trying to root out corruption. I don't want to buy a politician. Well, where do you really buy the politician? It's in their vote on the law, right? We don't disclose anything about who that politician talked to about the law process. We all focus on the election side. And there's all these disclosures about the election side. But when it comes to the lawmaking process, they can pass whatever laws they want. You have no idea who they talk to. You don't even know who asked them to run the law. You don't know any of that. Nothing's. They have some disclosures on lobbyists if they spend funds. But if you go up to Utah and you say, "Who's running this bill? Who had the idea for it?" They don't talk about it. And I've done it too. I ran a bill. I ran bills at the legislature. None of the reps knew who was running it. The one that I talked to knew, but nobody else knew. No one in Utah knew that Oregon was behind the bill. And there's no disclosures associated with that. And so if you ask, well, are we really concerned about corruption? Or are we just shifting it somewhere else? To me, it becomes very problematic to look at to say, if we keep the two political parties as being able to give unlimited funds to the candidates, they control at this point. A centralized power in two parties. That's what it did. When we talk about a two-party system, we see deals of it. I believe the campaign finance laws significantly hurt that. We'll try and wrap up here pretty quick, but two that are interesting to look at in Utah law. So Utah says media prohibitions, paid advertisements permitted. I like how they say this because they talk about an owner, publisher, editor, all these people of a newspaper or other periodical may not solicit, receive, or accept any payment, promise, or compensation for influencing or attempting to influence any voting.
Slow down. Wow.
So they can't accept money to run an article that would influence a vote.
Is that where you put paid advertisement?
That's where they put paid advertisement. It says the prohibitions contained in this section do not apply yet. The matter is inserted in the newspaper, has a paid advertisement, and is designated as a paid advertisement. So I can't go to KSL and say, hey, I'll pay you some money if you run some stories for me. That might help me get elected. But who, again, can choose to run those stories? KSL can still choose to run them.
It's a very vague definition too. So, by any means whatsoever. If you could, then they should stop publishing altogether.
Oh, let's also look at this one. I love this one. False statements in relation to candidates forbidden. A person may not knowingly make or publish or cause to be made or published any false statement in relation to any candidate, proposed constitutional amendment, or other measure that is intended or tends to affect any voting at any primary, convention, or election. Is this constitutional? This is Utah law. Utah just banned all misinformation that might influence the vote.
So I have a question about the newspaper running different ads. How can they pick? Because wasn't there a controversy a while back, not too long ago, about one person can have their stuff in the newspaper, one political.
Yeah, so this law, this first one, says, well, you can influence a vote or an election with paid advertising. And you can't take more than normal ads for it. But do they have to let both sides in? Or can you say, we only let Republicans, or we only let Democrats advertise here? Well, Utah had a law called equal access, something that said if you accept it from one political party, you have to accept it from the other. Because that was happening. But that's kind of gone by the wayside for the most part. So they could still choose to say, well, I'm opposed to this ideology or this ideology, I don't want to run it. And then the law says, well, if it's an equal type thing, well, then don't run any. But morally, I feel compelled to speak about this. I want to. Someone paid me to. I'm an attorney. People pay me to speak. And then you can't knowingly make a false statement.
There's
And that's again the law in Utah. Thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not lie.
Defender of the truth, that's what you want.
How do you know it's true or false sometimes?
yeah.
Well, it does use the word knowingly, so they have to be able to prove you knew it was false.
Which is tricky.
But still, let's say that, let's say I just one day said, all these people are racist. I knew that wasn't true, but I said it. I was frustrated. Have my constitutional rights gone?
Is this for corporations still, or this is for people?
A person, any person in Utah, any corporation, any media company any individual, any candidate, technically.
There's your influencers.
You can't say anything you know.
Which very well might make a statement like.
So it's interesting to look at how Utah, some of the things Utah has. But with it, one other really fun question with campaign finance, it's a huge issue right now. Can foreign governments speak American?
Well, we owe them a lot of money.
They're very interested in what happens here, right? We have
They-
huge debts to them.
They probably could own us at this point.
China, we owe a lot of money to China.
How did that happen and why did it happen? We're America and people.
Treasury bonds, national debt.
Just like me.
What happens is, if you want to know the economics, it's pretty simple. We buy a lot of things from China. So US dollars go to China to pay those companies. Chinese banks then sit on tons of American dollars. They need to get it back to America to be of any value. America puts out and says, we'll sell treasury bonds if we finance our government because we're not raising enough in taxes and we're spending way more than we want to. So all the Chinese banks and Chinese government says, okay, we'll send American dollars back and buy those bonds. And there's a huge trade imbalance, so these companies get tons of American dollars stored up that they then have to put back in. And we are taking their money back. We're not exporting our own stuff as much as they are. So the trade imbalance creates money sitting in their accounts they want to put back. They become very willing to buy our treasury bonds, our debt, to put their money to work.
It's going to be really interesting watching Judgment Day. It's kind of like,
Just make sure your house is paid off before then. Okay?
Actually, I don't think you can get a title to us prepared to do. I have a friend in Australia has the same problem, and a friend in Idaho can't get a title to her house. She's paid off. You get a digital copy, but you can't get an actual title.
Physical one, yeah.
Australia's have big conflict about that. They can't do anything about it.
Yeah, digital age, right? And so again, let's say the law came out and banned foreign government speech. Okay, well then can the foreign government set up a company in America?
if they haven't already.
You know, what about Toyota? Can they talk in America? Do they have enough interest to talk, but maybe Russian oil doesn't? I don't know. What starts to happen? And so a lot of people want to ban foreign speech. I say, okay, I can understand that. I'm not a huge fan of foreign governments trying to change our elections. But are we banning anything, or are we just shifting how it happens, making it harder to detect? I'd almost rather it just be make it real easy as long as there's a disclosure. We all know this is from the Chinese government, okay. But I don't know. And then, what if their citizens come speak at a political rally? Can we say, no, you can't speak here? You're not a US citizen. It's interesting. And going back to the start with the balance, how do we keep ourselves from anarchy with things that happen? And what are the laws? What do we need to do? And so, I don't think we need to start over, but I think we need to be pretty thoughtful about how do we strike this balance? Because there has to be a balance. We have to have some level of collection. It can't be just an anarchy type thing, but it can't be so burdensome that people can't speak to and do things. And my personal opinion about current laws is that they're incumbent protection measures.
Would you be interested in running for president?
Sure.
Okay, I'll vote for you because then you can fix this. So you can tell me what to do.
Hey, we'll just start our third party today, and we're gonna figure out how to get around these laws, right?
Right.
We're gonna do it.
Know how to make them better.
No, but I'm not joking aside. So in January, we are gonna start meeting monthly to talk about how to do something about these issues and make it so that something besides the Republicans and Democrats can control.
I'm in.
So that is happening. We will start proactively addressing these issues because I don't want to just talk about it. I want to do something about it. So I'd love for you to join us. So these are some of the things to understand. Corruption. If they're fighting corruption, they can limit your speech. require disclosures, very complex sets of disclosures. There's currently over 10,000 pages of federal regulation on all the disclosures that are associated with that for federal candidates. Very extreme and very difficult to comply with. Individuals and companies currently can spend unlimited amounts on independent expenditures where they don't coordinate with the candidate. And so we have the super PACs that people are upset about. But the reason those exist is because the Supreme Court said those don't corrupt politicians because there's not an exchange. They're not communicating, so there's not a, buying of a vote. But the legislative and executive process remains subject to very few disclosures where the corruption really happens. To me, that's a concern. And then the current campaign finance laws make it very, very hard for a viable third party to form. And
So is that the first one we should change?
the last thing?
Yeah.
Well, so just the laws that exist, this is the state of the laws. The effect is all of us still feel our government's very corrupt. We don't feel it's cleaned it up. So it's shifted where the corruption happens or how it happens. And then, just sitting here, non-attorneys can think of ways to circumvent these laws. You get a group of attorneys together, there's a whole lot of ways to circumvent the laws, do things.
So they would be good lawyers,
People here?
well, to help circumvent the whatever's. I mean, because there's good and bad in everything.
Yeah, so when I run for president, you can just hire me as a consultant, okay?
Okay.
Yeah, donating to my campaign.
So we can have you as a consultant for United Women's Forum,
Yeah.
Sisters
I'll
of
just
Liberty.
consult on you how to be more involved in the political process, right?
Okay.
Or pay
How
me
does
for legal
speaking
advice on the
United Women's
Constitution.
It's invaluable.
So remember that. It's a deal when I run for president here.
Okay.
But yes. So any questions, any thoughts?
Thank you.
This doesn't speak to today, but I have a question about the Senate and the treaties.
Okay.
2/3 can vote to say World Health Organization to come in and it's
Yeah.
a serious issue. But having the WHO come here and take over sovereignty during the pandemic would actually be violating the Constitution, right?
Potentially.
Yes. And so how? So
How is that resolved?
Hmm?
How is that resolved?
Yes.
It's actually a little concerning because the Constitution didn't do a great job of saying it actually dictates what the supreme law of the land is. It says Constitution, treaties, and I think there's one other thing, are the supreme law of the land. So a treaty, when it's made, becomes the supreme law of the land.
That only if it also comes from the Constitution.
The Constitution doesn't say that. It's not expressed in the Constitution. And so there's this open question about if a treaty openly violates the Constitution, what happens? The Constitution just says, I'll actually you can pull it up for you so that you can see it. To see the actual text, because to me it is concerning. Let's see. We'll go to the Supremacy Clause. A little far here. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. The judges are bound by treaties. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding.
Would you say that again, please?
So that last part, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So it could be interpreted that a treaty could supersede the Constitution based on how a judge interprets this.
And so that would depend on whether he gets far off or not.
Maybe. Might depend on his morality. It might depend on maybe he's an honest judge that looks at the text and says, that's what it says. But the Constitution doesn't directly say that a treaty can't violate the Constitution.
The end result could be a revolution.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be. There's a lot of interesting forces at work. But again, to that question, I looked at it many times and I thought, oh, I don't love how they phrase this. Doesn't bode well, I don't think, for some of these constitutional challenges to treaties. Because it's not a great sentence that they used to. So, any other questions? So, next month we have January 11th. So what we're going to do is the second Thursday of each month, January through October, we'll have a meeting at 30. Tell people about it. We'd love to get a little bit bigger, get some more people. And then November and December will be the first Thursday. We're trying to stay away from the holidays. But January through October, second Thursday, so you can write that down. That's the 11th, I'm pretty sure, of January. And then it's January 16th at noon here, we're going to do kind of a professional meeting. We're actually going to talk about a constitutional issue, current one associated with the Corporate Transparency Act and some of that impact, and then start talking about how we can be proactive about changing some of these things and trying to tackle some of the power centers that exist and some of the imbalances that are there. That will be January 16th, and then after that, it will be the first Tuesday of each month after. So if you want to get emails on it directly, put your name on the list back there. I can email you. And then I'll try and email out some cases you can look at beforehand that talk about these things as well. And we'll try and post those once every week or two. But otherwise, we have the I Believe wristbands if you want one. And then
I want a shirt like yours. I'm wearing my other shirt that says Believe up here.
nice.
Yeah.
Did you not get a Believe in America one last time? Okay.
No, I got this one. And one that was a little bit smaller. One that was white that had something. Oh, this one, and then one that was white that had. Was it that one?
Yeah,
That one.
it's just a colored version.
Color.
Yeah. Yeah, colored. But yeah, this is our disguised. So the I says I believe it's a different I. And then in America, it's in America. So that's what we do. But thank you for coming. We appreciate it. And again, let me know if you have questions. If you have topics you want to talk about, I'm willing to present on those if you have things. So currently my battery's running low, so it's a good time to do that.